This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com. We've had a background creating personal work in primarily the area of self-development, which is really spiritual self-development, because we are absolutely spiritual beings having a human experience. That's the trunk that leads up the tree of the branches of health of the natural world, environmental health, as well as mental and physical health on both an individual and then global societal level, which we desperately need to improve because it's evolve or perish, grow up or die time for humanity. This has led us into interests and experience with entheogens, especially their usage within indigenous traditions, as well as areas such as esotericism, which means the little known inside. Searching into some of these alternate areas inevitably touches on other areas that could be related to conspiracy, or what's sometimes called conspirituality, which is a somewhat catch-all term for people who are in alternate spiritual or medicinal communities. Becoming more open to conspiracy is an early stage in spiritual growth, which is essentially due to a distrust in cultural institutions and a realizing that they have not been fully or sometimes even partially honest with the public. Spending over a decade in this and its adjacent orbiting material, and in the early days of it thinking most conspiracies had validity, we've matured into realizing certain things were very wrong within conspiracy. Primarily because of many folks within this area's support for the election of a deplorable excuse for a human being to the presidency of the United States in 2016, and then how it dealt with the COVID-19 situation. Mainly having a strong one-sided anti-vax, anti-science thread, we came to notice two patterns running in many alternate media circles, especially those related to conspiracy and sometimes even conspirituality, which has caused us to be much less supportive of both said subjects. The philosopher Terence McKenna, who had mushroom gnosis, would sometimes say, "I'm not very supportive of conspiracy theory, and we've come to now see more why. Because at the time of this recording, we're now 50-50 at best regarding it. Some conspiracies are valid, while others breed irrational or baseless thinking. So it's crucial to recognize that this term can be politically charged and might be used to dismiss legitimate concerns by painting them as mere conspiracies. But as with any conspiracy theory, the validity of the claims associated with it should be evaluated based on evidence and critical analysis." The first negative pattern we started to notice within conspiracy circles is the accurate identification of problems, but then proposing batshit crazy solutions, specifically related to what is public and what is private, and a heavy asymmetry towards giving the private a pass. Being very 50-50 on the subject, the other main pattern is we've honestly come to think that 50+% of conspiracy, the half we don't buy, is really just extreme right-wing politics in disguise. Nothing more. Since everything is all about the money, in the United States, liberal-leaning politics is typically associated with progressivism, social equality of opportunity, and government uses in the economy to achieve social goals on behalf of the middle class, which is generally more compassionate. Modern heavy-handed conservatism wants you to think it's somehow for individual freedoms, and often gives false binaries such as freedom or government control, when a more accurate juxtaposition would be public democratic governance or private corporate control. Conservative policies in the United States, while claiming and historically for many decades having had some semblance of being for individual liberty, free market principles, and limited government intervention in economic and personal matters, doesn't actually do those things now, and has basically been replaced with this neo-fascism, which protects the wealth and power of godzillionaires and mega corpses, which hurts the individual, rigs the market to be corporate crony markets, uses government policy only to give tax cuts to the top 0.1%, privatizes nearly everything for corporate profit, amplifies corporate greed through deregulation, gets into quagmire holy wars in the Middle East for oil and Israel, and then because of those shit policies has been screwing over the middle class and the poor for nearly half a century. and then goes off and tells people that immigrants are the ones to blame for their middle-class ills. Most conspiracy accurately identifies that the way the world really works is that a small number of extremely wealthy people, probably a few thousand on a planet, or as the flat earthers would say, on a plane, you lose the T, of some 7 billion people, have a massively disproportionate influence on governments throughout the world, controlling industry and public policy. Authoritarian governments are awful. Democratic governments, while messy, are the most representative of all people and have the most freedom. A lot of folks in conspiracy, not even when speaking of authoritarian governments, but instead within democracies, tend to say phrases like, governments lie, or all politics is corrupt, or it doesn't matter who you vote for, or both parties one puppet string puller. The problem with all of this is, first off, not what they're saying, what they're not saying. Which is that corporations lie even more, and that the reason governments lie is because they're corporatized, meaning they're captured only by private corporate interests. This is evident by the fact that newspapers 50 years ago had both a labor section, meaning speaking for the majority of working people, and a business section, meaning speaking for the small amount of private business owners. And fast forward to today, only now have a business section. The next problem with the all governments lie and are totally corrupt mindset is that it throws all governments into the trash can for working people, which is a very right-wing misdirection trick. We were listening to the podcast of someone who we are generally fond of, who we've had as a past guest on earlier iterations of our own podcast, and now has their own podcast. Everyone's got a podcast, yay! They had a guest on who was doing a really amazing deconstruction and analyzing of the problems with various cultural institutions such as corporatized universities and the corporate media. It was one of those things that are very common in the current podcast space, which is that the first hour was free to listen to and then the second hour was for members only, with the first hour of the discussion being tracking problems and then the second hour being where some solutions were proposed. And since we're not yet a member of their podcast, we honestly couldn't tell from the first half of the conversation if it was doing what we've seen far too many related discussions doing, such as many conversations on the Higher Side Chats podcast, which is one of the world's foremost conspiracy podcasts that we have been a past guest on and are certainly now very 50-50 on the guests regarding, because like it and this other podcast, it seemed many conspiracy guests are just sending people down into something more aggressive politically by giving a complete pass to private corporate corruption and oligarchic corruption, and only talking about corruption in more public areas such as universities or governments, which have only happened because they've become over the decades so for-profit privatized by corporate interests. Another problem with the government's lie oversimplified talking point is that the problems between left and right are not symmetrical within U.S. politics. While both parties in the U.S. absolutely have problems, mainly that they are both heavily captured by the conservative-leaning Israel lobby, and we are going to do an upcoming series of insights on the problems of the extremes of the left, the difference between issues stemming from the left-wing policies are probably 15% of the problem, while the issues stemming from right-wing policies are more like 85% of the problem. So why not work to continually be involved in fixing the better and more truthful of two dysfunctional options? So throwing one side, which has some corruption, meaning it mainly works on behalf of the middle class, but sometimes also helps the morbidly rich, into the same pot as the side that does nothing for the middle class and exclusively only helps the morbid rich and their policies, means conservative conspiracy solutions are an oxymoron. If anything, we'd buy a conspiracy if it leads to having more liberal ideas, so that the government more works on behalf of the wide range of people instead of the micro-narrow spectrum of special corporate oligarchic interests. In terms of accurately identifying problems and then proposing batshit crazy solutions, the extreme right-wing QAnon cult's pitch is, hey, there's a global network of sex traffickers and sex abusers, many of which hurt children, so let's try and put one in the White House and give the others tax breaks. While in the US, what is considered more left-leaning conspiracy, sometimes labeled BlueAnon, alleges things like various right-wing groups are systematically engaged in widespread voter suppression efforts to disenfranchise Democratic voters, particularly minority groups, which is an example of something that is much more factually accurate. We used to keep an eye on the work of an individual who dove heavily into the conspiratorial as one of their main pillars. Even though they claimed their work had little to do with politics, every time they did touch on the political, everything they were saying became the same things the dark imperial agents of the Christian right, really the Christian wrong, were saying, who want to turn liberal democracy into a fascist nightmare with the incredibly unpopular anti-American Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 proposed theocratic hellscape. This individual even started getting into the work of Nazi esotericist Julius Evola and alternate World War II history, which basically means the Nazis were good guys. Which is not only batshit, but also is a green light for heading towards fascism. Fuck that, and no way Jose. So after the realization of, oh my gosh, their work is just about politics, nothing more, light bulb moment going off for us, after deciphering the pattern that they were just leading people towards essentially fascism, but doing it in overt ways, we figured we might as well include forward-thinking, more balanced politics into our work in order to counter that type of awfulness. This is why we've gotten more political with what we call pro-democratic political philosophy mixed into our work in the last couple years, and why much of it has been so up front and center in our material, because democracy is hanging by a thread in the US, and it's us that need to keep fighting to save it for future generations. Extremely rich captains of industry, via their tentacles such as their political organizations, lobbyists, etc., are very interested and involved in politics and want to turn democracies throughout the world into authoritarian regimes, which is an ongoing fight because it helps them and not you. Representative liberal democracy, while sloppy and slow, and direct democracy would be even better, and the 7 liberal arts, all have the ability to help you over helping them. But it also requires an educated and informed voting electorate to be the arbiters of who gets into the halls of power, and who can sift through the massive signal-to-noise of corporate media propaganda, which is not easy and requires knowledge of the logical fallacies to see through all the lies. But being practical about shared public resources, communal responsibility, and a healthy middle class and thus democracy shouldn't even be a partisan issue. The whole con is to get the middle class and the poor people to fight against one another, which only helps morbid wealth. The oligarch controllers want people to be more conservative, meaning more protective of private wealth hierarchy. And they certainly want them to be less liberal, meaning openness and freedom of mind and heart, and less social, being publicly community-minded. We are fiercely independent, but we very much recognize that shared public communal resources are crucial for any healthy community. Liberal democracy requires a strong, activist, public-minded, progressive, meaning wanting to evolve, middle class, and fascists have been trying to destroy that our whole life. If anything, being more progressive, meaning wanting to help the middle class and electing those who enact policies which do so, in your politics should be like step 3 of 10 in your spiritual development. And since more conservative policies generally protect wealth hierarchy, while extreme right-wing fascist policies that claim they're conservative not only protect wealth hierarchy, but empower power-hungry villains like Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, and Vladimir Putin, it boggles our mind that so many conspiracy folks then end up falling down right-wing rabbit holes. If anything, they should end up being less conservative and more progressive in their politics to more support the middle class, instead of being down for intolerant, extreme ideologies that breed fascist dictators. So our confession on this one is that all of our spiritual self-development themed work is not only intended to help you in your personal development, but the road to that is paved in helping making you a more compassionate and open-hearted and open-minded person. More compassion for the environment, more compassion for the lives of other people, regardless of their economic class, more compassion for all animal life, more liberal in the classical sense of the word, and especially more compassionate for the plight of indigenous peoples, such as femicide of indigenous women. But you must start to step outside the empire to do that. The majority of those who read this or hear this will be like, OMG, right on, so true, thumbs up. But those who have stopped reading or listening to these essays because they think what we're saying has been bleeding heart lib woke are not only more compassionless, but deeper in the empire.